that it has a very it draws and is inspired by a lot of pre-Columbian art, including a really wonderful book of his that is based on codices. It's like an almost an accordion fold book that I think does a great job of drawing again from that inspiration and bringing storytelling to us in a different way than we might be used to. And through all of this work that he does, it really does an amazing job of bringing images and stories to honor the past, but are relevant to people, especially children. In today, there's a lot of subjects around social justice issues, art, history, and immigration. And so the books that Duncan writes and the illustrations that he brings are this really fascinating mix of history as well as the current issues and the current society that we see today. We're going to hear from Duncan. He's going to talk more about, how he goes through the process of illustrating and creating books. And he's going to share with us actually some images from one of his recent books or his upcoming book. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A session as well. So as Duncan is speaking, please think about any questions you might have or comments, and we'll use the chat here through Zoom to kind of create that speaking list. Okay, enough of me speaking. I'm going to throw it over to Duncan to lead us today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for being here. I hope everyone can hear me well, see me well. And yeah, I mean, I think since we're a small group, feel free to, if you have questions throughout to be there. I don't think it'll be too disruptive. But what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about my journey of how to become an author, illustrator. Definitely share with you a little bit of some of the things that I've learned along the way. And I also want to share with you my latest book that's coming out, A Land of Books, that I'm very excited about. And I definitely want to leave time for questions. And I'd be curious to know, if some of you are educators, because maybe I can also share some resources with you. But first I'll tell you a little about myself, and then maybe we can, then maybe after I can share some of that with you if it's helpful to you. But so yes, my name is Duncan, or in Spanish everyone calls me Duncan Tonatiuh, and I grew up in, I was born in Mexico, and when my family was about 8 years old, I moved to a smaller city called San Miguel de Allende, which is a very pretty city in central Mexico. And when I moved there, I didn't know a lot of the kids in my neighborhood, a lot of the kids in my school. And that's when I became interested in reading, because I would borrow a lot of books from my school library. That was a way for me to spend the afternoons. My parents had sold the TV that we had in our apartment in Mexico City. So I didn't have a TV, that's before smartphones and the internet. So I would borrow a lot of books from my school library. They had this series called Choose Your Own Adventure. And I would borrow one, and a few days later, I would borrow another one. And because I liked reading, I began thinking maybe someday I could be an author. Maybe that's something that I could do, that I could do later on when I'm older, when I grow up. And whenever I had assignments at my school, I would get carried away, and especially if it had to do with writing. And I would, if they said, "Oh, write a page for your homework," I would write several pages of, especially if it had to do with writing stories. And around that same time, when I was about 8, when I moved to San Miguel, it's also when I became very interested in drawing, because soon after we moved, my cousins from Mexico City, some of my cousins from Mexico City came to visit me in San Miguel, and they brought a stack of comic books like Spider-Man and X-Men and the Avengers. And I'd never seen comic books, so I was really excited when I saw them. And I would, I began saving my allowance to buy my own comics. I began collecting them. But usually I would get together with my cousins during the summer break or winter break. We would all go to my grandma's house in Mexico City and spend the holidays there. And we would, share our comic books, exchange them, but we would also draw our own superheroes and come up with our own stories and our own villains. And that's when I started drawing. And it's something that I never stopped doing. It's something that I continue being interested in as I got older. And so by the time I was a teenager, I was very confident that I wanted to pursue a career of the arts, in the arts. And I did a year of high school in San Miguel, but I didn't like the high school here. I didn't like the high school in San Miguel. And I'm both Mexican and American. My father's from the US, my father's American. And so therefore I'm a dual citizen. And I have family in both countries, in Mexico and in the United States. And I ended up going to a high school in Massachusetts, a very arts-oriented high school that a cousin of mine went to. And he thought I would like it because he really liked it and he knew I liked art. And so I went to his high school and I really enjoyed it. And then I went to art school, to design school in New York City, where I studied art. I took a lot of drawing classes, but I also went to the school, to Parsons. It's called Parsons School of Design, because I could take classes at its sister school called Eugene Lang, where I could do a lot of writing because I was both interested in drawing and writing, and I didn't want to give one up. I wanted to continue to do both, and I was able to do it at the program they had there. But when I came to the US, I started, as the years went on, I began missing things that were around me growing up in Mexico, that were always around me, like the food, the music, different traditions. And I started missing those things, and I became kind of more curious about them, and I think sometimes when you're like away, when you're somewhere and the culture always sort of surrounds you, you don't think about it much, but when you're away, sometimes you see it from a different light. So, maybe a holiday like the Day of the Dead, which is just something that happened every November 1st and 2nd that I never thought twice about. When I was somewhere else where it wasn't celebrated or celebrated as much, I began to see, wow, that's a really special celebration and really unique and really different. And so I became really interested in the art of Mexico and issues that affect people of Mexican origin in both Mexico and the US, because there's such a large Mexican and Mexican American community in the United States. And in my projects at my university, whenever I had an assignment, I would often connect it to, if I was able to my Mexican background. So for example, I remember I took a photography class, and I decided to go photograph this immigrant protest that was happening, where there were a lot of immigrants from different countries, but a lot of them from Mexico participating. Or for example, I took a writing class, a fiction writing class, and I tried to write a short story that took place in San Miguel, remembering what it was like when I was a kid. And so whenever I had the opportunity, I would do that. In my last year of my university, I had to have a senior project. And I wasn't quite exactly sure what to do. I wanted to do something with writing, with drawing, maybe something kind of like a graphic novel, I thought, that talked about politics or current events. And when I was from New York, I met a friend named Sergio, who is who's from Mexico, but he is Mixtec or Mixtec. And Mixtecs are a indigenous group from southern Mexico. And there's a large Mixtec community in the tri-state area of New York. And I thought his story was really interesting because he came from this small village in southern Mexico, and now he was working at this restaurant in New York City. And one thing that really struck me when I met him is that instead of speaking Spanish or English with his coworkers, his cousins, he would speak his Mixtec language, his Mixtec dialect. And he had organized, he had fought for better wages at this restaurant, even though he could have gotten in trouble because he was undocumented. He didn't have the proper documents to come into the US. And so I thought that his story was interesting and powerful. And I decided that was going to be my senior thesis. And so one of the first things that I did was go to my university's library and look up Mixtec artwork. And here, let me grab a book really quick. And then in books at the library, I found these kinds of drawings. These are drawings that the Mixtec people made hundreds of years ago, about 500 years ago. And there's more like 600. And there's modern day Mixtecs, indigenous people from the states of Guerrera, Puebla, Oaxaca, and many have migrated to different parts of the US. But the Mixtecs were also a civilization similar to the Aztecs, the Maya, that built pyramids. They had their own way of dressing, they had their own language, and they made books. The Mixtecs and other people in Mesoamerica made these large books, long books, that we now call codices. We usually refer to them as codices. The Mixtecs would actually paint on the hides of deer. And then in these books, they would tell their stories of their warriors, their kings, their gods. But they had a very unique way of drawing. People are always in profile. We always see them to the side, never with both eyes looking straight ahead. Their drawings are very stylized. The way they draw ears and hands and feet is very unique. And I had seen these kinds of drawings when I was a kid. Like, for example, I remember in one of my textbooks, when I was in elementary school, it had a picture of the Aztec calendar, of this round stone that has the sun in the middle, sticking its tongue out like this. Or in San Miguel, there's an artisans market, a crafts market, where people sell different artisans sell crafts, and sometimes they'll sell these paintings that look a little bit like this, like these drawings. But to be honest, when I was a kid, the things that inspired me to draw were comic books. Later on, it was like anime and manga, the Japanese cartoons that I would see on TV once my parents bought a TV again. But it wasn't until I had lived in many years in the US that I saw these kinds of drawings again, that I became interested in them, and that I wanted to draw in this kind of style. So this is actually my senior project that I did when I was in college. It's called Journey of a Mixteco. And it folds out like that, like an accordion. It's long, it's this long strip. And then here, Sergio telling his story of growing up in Guerrero, and then having to work from a young age, of coming to the US without the proper documents. And if you can see, I did, it's all drawn in that style. It's all in profile, and the way I draw ears, the way I draw hands, it's all inspired by these kinds of drawings. One thing that I decided to do differently for my project, and that I still do for my illustrations, is that if you can see, I include a lot of textures in them. So for example, here Sergio's jeans look like real jeans, or let me see, for example, here, the background is like this newspaper, it has a texture of a newspaper. And so what I do is that I draw on a piece of paper, just a letter size piece of paper with a pencil. Then I go over it with a pen. So for example, here are some drawings from my latest book. And then sometimes, you'll see that I draw the arms sometimes separate, because then I can like paste them on top in the computer. But I draw just, with a pencil, and then go over my drawing with a pen. And then I use my scanner. I have this little scanner here that I, plug into my computer, and I scan my drawings, and then I collage textures into my illustrations. So let me show you how I do that. Share my screen so I can show you how I do that. Let me just open my file first. Of a drawing that I did. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, can everyone, Lynn, can you see the drawing? Okay, excellent. So this is just a drawing that I did. And so you know, you can scan drawings, but I have all sorts of different textures that I've scanned in a folder. And so, for example, this is a texture I use a lot of this brown paper bag. And it's just a paper bag that they gave me at the supermarket to put my groceries in. And I liked its texture, so I scanned it in the scanner. And then here in Photoshop, I can select it. I can copy it. And I go back to the drawing and I choose different areas. You know, the face, the hand. Let's see if I can do the neck there. Let me get in a little closer. And then I can paste into it. And that becomes the skin. So it's as if I grab that paper bag and I cut it with scissors and glued it on top of my drawing, but instead of using scissors and glue, I collage it this way. I call it a digital collage. You know, I can do her pants, for example. So here's just a pair of jeans that I put on top of the scanner. And now I can see their texture there also. I copy them. I paste into them. And a lot of things I scan, but some things are a little harder to scan. So for example, it'd be hard to scan, you know, like hair. I could try and put my head in the scanner and scan hair that way. But instead of doing that, what I do is that I take a photograph of someone's hair, or I can find a photograph on the internet. And so, for example, for hair, here's a texture I use a lot. And it's an image I found on the internet of this Elvis wig. And I can copy it. And I go back here, I paste into it. Sometimes I have to stretch things out a little, maybe rotate them around a little, but that becomes the hair. And so that's how I create my illustrations. And so I was doing this book, I was doing this project at my university. And one day in the middle of the semester, we had to put our artwork up on the walls. And we had some guest teachers, some guest professors that were coming to critique our work. And a woman that taught at Parsons named Julia Gorton, she wasn't my teacher, but she was a professor at the university, thought that what I was doing was interesting. She thought that these illustrations, you know, were very unique. And she had illustrated some children's books. And she asked if she could show them to this editor that she was friends with. And I said, oh, yes, please, you know, take this printout, take that printout. And this editor, a man named Howard at a company called Abrams Books, liked them, you know, and his office happened to be very close to where I went to school. It was about 8 blocks from my university. So one day after class, I went and I met with him at his office. And he said, you know, this project, this book that you're doing for your school, it's interesting, but it's, you know, it's sort of a weird format for us to publish. And this is more really for older readers. I focus on books for younger readers. But if we receive a manuscript that someone else writes that we think would pair well with your illustrations, we would like to work with you. You know, we would like you to illustrate a book for us if we find the right story. And I said, that'd be wonderful. You know, here's my call, you know, here's my email, here's my cell phone number. But I like writing too. I'm actually taking all these writing classes. Maybe I could write the story. And so then the editor said, sure, that sounds like a good idea. She said, you know, if you write a picture book, you want to make it 32 pages or 40 pages, a multiple of 8, so that when all the pages get folded together, get bound, there's no paper wasted. He said, you know, leave a page there for the title page, leave a page there for the copyright page, you know, with information on where the book was published and what year and things like that. And my suggestion to you, he said, is, you know, make your main character, your protagonist, maybe a young person or an animal, someone that young people can identify with. And if you write something, you know, here's my number, here's my email, you can send it to me. And so sometime later, while I was still finishing this project, I had an idea for a book about two cousins, one that lives in a rural community in Mexico and one that lives in an urban center in the United States. And they write letters to each other about their everyday experiences. And so, I had the idea, I wrote in my notebook, I typed in my computer, but it was the first time I'd ever done I'd ever tried to write a picture book manuscript. So I thought, well, kids really like Dr. Seuss, so I should make my story rhyme like Dr. Seuss. So I try to make my story rhyme, and I sent to the editor. And some days later, he responded, I got your manuscript. I think this idea of the two cousins in different countries is interesting. I think I could make a good book. I think you would do a good job doing the illustrations for it, but no rhyming, please. Your rhymes are not very good. And so, I was a little disappointed when he said that, but I revised my story. I got rid of the rhymes and I rewrote it, and we sent it back and forth many times. But eventually I got a contract for my first book, and it became my first published book, which is this one, Dear Primo, a letter to my cousin. And in the story, a lot of things that Carlitos, one of the primos, one of the cousins, does in this story, like playing football, playing with canicas and papalotes, trompos, are things that I did as a kid. But the book is also very much inspired by the kids that I saw in New York, some of the things they did, like getting splashed by the fire hydrants, some of the way they dressed, the games they played, different traditions they celebrated. And so the book is about the differences, one likes to play football, the other one likes to play basketball. But I realized the book is also about the similarities, because they both like sports. One likes quesadillas and the other one likes pizza. They both like cheesy food. They both like spending time with their family, with their friends, celebrating different holidays, different traditions. And I feel that that's one thing I've learned by living in both the United States and by having family in both countries, is that even though some things are, can be very different, I think people are more alike than different. And I think that's especially true when it comes to children. And so after I did this book, this kind of opened this world of picture books to me that I'd never considered, like I mentioned a little earlier. I wanted to be an artist since the time I was a teenager. But I always thought I was going to do things for adults, maybe write a novel or take photographs for a magazine or do paintings that hang in galleries. I didn't consider doing books for young readers till this opportunity presented itself of meeting this editor. And I'm super happy that it did, because, I've loved writing and drawing since I was a kid. And so I'm able to do those two things in picture books. And I've really come to love writing for kids, because I get to, I've made a lot of books about things that I want to learn more about, I'll tell you in a second about my latest book, but I wanted to learn, for example, more about the people that made these kinds of books, that made the codices. And so I learned about it and researched it and then tried to turn it into hopefully an interesting book for young readers. So I feel very lucky that I get to do that for a living. And another thing that I really like about making books for young readers is that I don't think books for young readers need to be happy, but I do think they need to have a positive message or a hopeful message. And I enjoy that. I enjoy working on that. And I think that's something very important. But are there any questions so far? There's some other things that I'd like to share with you, but I'm curious to know if there's any questions so far.
While I'm thinking of it, and since you asked, I do have a question. It seems like Abrams is supportive. You've written a few books that could be maybe considered more adult issues, like segregation, integration, workers' rights, that sort of thing. And it's great that your publisher supports introducing these complex issues to children, but how do you tackle those in the cases of those particular books, tackle those big adult issues and try and, focus it down to a way that children can understand. And also, was there ever any question of whether these were maybe not inappropriate issues to bring up to children, but could be considered controversial? We're dealing with some things in the country right now where there's a lot of books being challenged, that sort of thing, for various reasons. But so I had two rambling questions there. How do you tackle these big adult issues in a way that children can understand? And was there ever any question of whether, maybe that's not appropriate for a children's book or something like that?
Yeah, those are great questions. So I've done this is gonna be my 14th book, and all my books are very different from one another. Some are fiction, some are nonfiction, but one thread they have in common is that they have to do with Mexican culture or Mexican American culture in some way. And out of the books that I made, one of my interests has definitely been social justice. And so I made a book. Let me grab them really quick in case you guys haven't seen them. I made, for example, a book called Pancho Rabbit and the Coyote. And I made a book called Separate is Never Equal. And Pancho Rabbit is a bit like a fable, like the Little Red Riding Hood, but it's also an allegory of the journey, of the dangers that migrants often go through to reach the US, like riding on top of trains, crossing the river, walking through the desert. So the book can be read, you can imagine that it reads just like a fable, but you can also, it's also an allegory. And then, for example, I did this book, Separate is Never Equal, which is nonfiction, which is about this civil rights case that took place in the 40s, some years before Brown versus Board of Education. And in the Mendez family and other Latino families fought because their children weren't allowed to go to school with white children in California, in Southern California. And they actually won this case in California. The schools there were the first to be desegregated. And this was very common throughout the Southwest of the United States. And yeah, so my editor has always been supportive of me, making books about these themes. I think, for example, in the case of Separate is Never Equal, one challenge was when writing it, like that, I wanted to make sure I included dates, different judicial concepts. It had a lot of kind of information, but hopefully that wouldn't kind of bog down the story too much. So kind of finding that balance. I've read this story to kids many, many times, and they connect with the story. And I think one thing that really helps is that the protagonist in the story is Silvia. It's a young person, a young girl. So I think that definitely kind of helps when making a book about these topics to connect with children. And I think they often see a lot of similarities to some of the challenges that Silvia, or one of the reasons why I wanted to make the book. Well, children, when they read this book, they definitely see the injustice in the story, and that's not right, that's not how you should treat people, that kids shouldn't be sent to separate schools. That's the reaction that I get from children when I share the story with them. And I wanted to make this book because even though it's a story that takes place more than 70 years ago now, I think it's relevant to kids now because there's still a lot of division in US schools. Maybe it's not the kind of legal segregation that existed in the 40s, but there's, schools with more resources, with more teachers tend to be predominantly Anglo or white, and schools that where the majority of the students are poor and maybe they have less resources, maybe there's less teachers, tend to be mostly Black or Latino students. So I think it's very different, but there's some parallels between the segregation of the 40s and some of the division that happens in schools now. and it's, you know, with this book, it's actually, they've tried to ban it recently in a few places. And it's, you know, the book came out in 2014, and it's, you know, it's received several awards, and it's been used in a lot of classrooms. And I think definitely in the last, you know, year or two, things have gotten so much more politically divisive. And I think sadly, books have kind of become politicized, you know, oftentimes without kind of having enough context, you know, of what the, you know, oftentimes, like when I've had I've received a lot of positive comments about the book. Where the times that I've received negative comments about it, it's usually from people that even haven't read the book, you know, that they've already kind of made up their mind about what they think. So, you know, in my experience publishing books that deal with social justice, I've always received a lot of support for it. I think the challenge is hopefully doing in a way that is appropriate, and I guess just that children can connect to it, you know, that kids can relate to it. And but I think it's very important. I think it's very important about talking about those topics. One of the most powerful experiences, you know, when I did this book, this Pancho and the Coyote, I was, soon after the book came out, I was invited to speak at this book festival, at a book festival in Texas. And when I did, there was this group of students that introduced me, you know, and they said a few things, you know, Mr. Tonatiuh has made this book. And then he said, but then now we want to share a short video we made after we read his book, Pancho and the Coyote. And so I'd like to share that with you, because I think it really, it speaks of the power that books can have, and why I think it's important to make books about, you know, multicultural books, especially. So let me share my screen really quick. 1 second. Okay.
I'm 10 years old. I'm in first grade. I live in the United States. I always have.
I came here when I was a baby.
Yo vine hace 2 años.
My parents grew up in the United States, but my family speaks Spanish.
My grandpa said they grew up very poor.
My dad said there was no work in Mexico.
In Honduras. In Guatemala.
My mom said we could go to school in the United States and have the education she didn't get to have.
My family decided that we will go.
My best friend told me how he swam across the river. My mom told me how cold the water was and how she held me close because I was just a baby.
My dad said he crossed the desert. He said he has no food, no water, no shoes, no money. That's how my tío died.
My mom tried to come here 3 times before she got across. I waited for her for a year.
I came across it at night. We ran. We were quiet.
We had nothing, just a phone number of my cousin who would come pick us up.
Now we're here.
Some of us were born here. Some of us were carried here as babies.
Some of us just came here. Apenas llegué.
But we all want the same thing.
To learn,
to grow,
to find a way.
I want to be a doctor. I want to be a vet.
I want to be a teacher.
I want to be an artist. I want to be an author. Will you let me?
Yeah, I wanted to share that video. That video, I didn't make it. I had, you know, it was this teacher, this 4th grade teacher that made it with her students. But you know, I think the video is very moving, especially the first time I heard it and I saw it. But it made me feel hopeful in the sense that I thought that, like, that my book had encouraged students to know that their voices are important, that their experiences are important. And I think that's some of the power of books, you know, and oftentimes in literature for kids, they talk about windows and mirrors, you know, and of like how books can be a window, I think, to learn about someone else's experience, to learn about a different culture. And I think that's very important because I think books can help. You know, when you learn about someone that practice a different religion, is of a different race, of a different sexual orientation, you're less likely to have prejudice against them because you've met them a little bit through books. But I think also the importance of books as mirrors, in that if you see stories that you can, where you see yourself reflected, where you see yourself connected to, that lets you know that your voice is important. And that's one of the reasons why I try and make multicultural literature, is that, you know, after I started making picture books, soon after I learned that in the United States, there's, you know, thousands of new books that come out every year, books for young readers. But out of all those books, only a small percentage are about, you know, Latino children, Black children, Asian American children. Even though there's such a diversity of kids in the United States, the books don't really reflect that diversity. And I think it's important because for those things that I said, you know, because you learn about someone that that has different experiences than you do. And also because I think it lets you know that your voice is important, that your experiences matter. But so yes, so hopefully you found that video moving and interesting.
That is an incredible video, Duncan. I can't imagine how it must have felt when you first saw that or presented that from those kids. I know the event is started to go to 10:45, but we have 2 questions in the chat that I was hoping we could have you speak to a little bit, and then, you know, maybe afterwards, if there aren't any other questions, we can have you sort of conclude the event, wrap up the events by sharing more about your kind of like your new book that you're speaking to.
Sure.
Okay. So Cheryl in the chat talked about how some other authors were mentioning like the importance of hope in stories for children. I think the video you just shared sort of did a great job in speaking to that, but is there more that you might like to add about hope and optimism within the books that you write?
Sure. Well, you know, for example, in the case of this book, even though segregation is not a happy topic, and it might not be the first thing that someone thinks about in a book for children, for young readers, you know, like in this story, the Mendez family, they fight and they're able to win this case, you know. And at the end of the story, I wanted to end it here, Silvia, you know, playing with these white children, which is something that, you know, soon after, you know, like the story begins like this, with a boy pointing at her and saying, you know, you don't belong here, go back to the Mexican school. And she's really upset. And then she remembers, after her mom tells her all that had to happen so that she could attend that school. You know, after her mom tells her, Silvia, don't you know that is why we fought? ¿Que no sabes que por eso luchamos? And she remembers all the different things that had to happen, and how they went to this, you know, on trial, and how they received support from different organizations. And so at the end, she ignores the kids that are saying mean things to her, and realizes that other kids want to be nice to her and want to play with her and want to be her friend. And, you know, by the end of the day, she makes a friend. And by the end of the school year, she makes lots of friends. So I think there's ways to hopefully, like I said, you know, have a hopeful, a positive message, even if it's a challenging topic. Yeah.
Thank you, Duncan. And Susan had asked a question as well. Maybe you could speak to. She'd asked, are the Meshtiks okay with you using, you know, that art form that you talked about, even though you are Mexican American? And so I guess, you know, has that been something that you've like come across or spoken to?
Well, I mean, this artwork was made hundreds of years ago. I'm not sure of modern Mixtec traditions. I mean, there's definitely art that that is inspired by this art that is still made in Mexico, but it's a little different. And I mean, I draw inspiration, you know, hopefully, you know, what I do is inspired by. It's not the exact same thing. And in my latest book, A Land of Books, I kind of get into, I don't think a lot of people know about this art, and so hopefully more people are aware of it. I decided to make this book, A Land of Books, because in Mesoamerica, before the Spanish and other Europeans came in the 1500s, the land they called Mesoamerica Namochtlalpan, a land of books, because there were different groups like the Mixtecs, the Mexica, or which were part of the Aztec Empire, the Maya, that made books. And there was this rich bookmaking tradition. And so hopefully I'm exposing more people to it. And so for the latest book, I wanted to learn more about the Tlahuiloque, the people that painted these books, how they made them, why they made them, what the books were about. The Mexica, for example, they made books with on paper, on amatl paper, from tree bark from the Amacahuitl tree. To obtain colors, they would obtain colors from plants, from minerals, from different insects. That's how they would obtain colors. They had to attend a special school called the Calmecac, because Tlahuiloque were very well regarded in Mexica society. They went to school with the noblemen and the warriors, because they had to know a lot about astronomy, about warfare, about all sorts of subjects to paint it on books. And one thing that I didn't know that I discovered while making this book that I think is really neat is that there would be book readings, at different festivals, and there would be a singer that sung the words that were painted on the books, and there would be musicians that played music as the book was being read, and dancers that danced as it was being read. It was, it was more of a performance with these books. The books that the Mexica and other groups painted, they're very different than our books, because they didn't have any letters in them. They only had drawings. But the drawings could be read, the color that someone was wearing meant something. The different symbols could represent years, could represent places, the position of hands, let you know maybe if they were making an alliance, declaring a war. So people, some people knew how to read these drawings, and that's why they're so stylized. Your average farmer, for example, wouldn't know how to read these books, but when there were these at different festivals, at different celebrations, there would be book readings when they would be able to see these books and hear the words that were painted on them. So hopefully I'm kind of continuing a tradition. That's what I like to think.
Awesome. Thank you for that answer, Duncan. We have another question here as well. Asking how are your books received in Mexico, and is the publishing process any different in Mexico compared to the United States?
Well, so far, all of my books have been published in the United States first. I have a few books that have been published in Mexico now, but I've had a lot more success in the United States. I've published a lot more books, sold a lot more books, and people are more familiar with my work. And I think because the United States is such a diverse country, but there aren't, I think, enough books that speak to that diversity. I think that there's a great desire for the kinds of books that I make. So I feel very, very lucky for that. There's a very good publishing industry in Mexico, but the publishing industry in the United States is way bigger. There's just a lot more books that get published every year, a lot more books that get printed. And so I also feel lucky that I have a lot of work, and I'm able to make a good living from being an author and illustrator, because the industry in the United States is so robust. But there's great publishers in Mexico, and great publishers that also do books related to Mexican culture. But I've definitely had a lot more success and are just better known in the United States.
Awesome, thank you. I have a question for you as well, Duncan. When you've read or presented your books at different events, have you noticed a difference in response from like children as compared to teens or as compared to adults?
Well, usually I think if I'm invited to speak somewhere, they're pretty familiar. They're familiar with my work and, you know, like I said, for example, Separate is Never Equal. There's been some controversy around it a little bit lately with, and not just my book, there's just, you know, so many books are kind of getting challenged and banned and whatnot. But when I visited schools, like I said, the response that I get from kids is, that's not fair. That's not how people should be treated. And the response that I often get from adults, from the teachers, especially if they're you know, Mexican American or Latino teachers, they're like, I wish there were books like this when I was a kid. You know, when I was a kid, there were no books where, you know, where I could hear these kinds of stories or where I could see myself represented. So when I'm that's usually the response I get. You know, it's always been very very positive. And so it's strange to see you know, kind of some animosity towards, like I said, not just my book, but books that deal with the civil rights, that deal with gender and sexual orientation and whatnot. I think that's it's, in my experience, it's something very recent and that's just become very politicized. But when I actually speak with people and visit schools, that's always the kind of response that I get.
Thank you for that, Duncan. Just to share with folks too, it's last week was actually Banned Books Week. The American Library Association has been doing this since the 80s because it has been an issue for a while, but recently there's been so many more attacks on it. And so just to kind of plug our local libraries, if that's something that you are as upset about as we are, as you should be, you know, supporting your local public libraries and local indie bookstores, yes, thanks, are great ways to start pushing back against those, as Duncan said, politicized and hateful attacks, usually from folks who have even read the books. So sorry, using a soapbox there.
Yeah, I mean, and I have no problem with, you know, I'm open to criticism, and I think there's always things that you can do better in a book. You know, I really consider myself I try and, like, I'm not the authority on Mesoamerican books. You know, I try to learn as much as I could and share with people and try and get it as right as I can. But I'm always open to criticism and to doing things better. But I think it's very different to criticize something than to just like ban it and take it out. And you know, I think those are two very kind of different things. I think it's completely fine to disagree with something, but I think it's very different to not want anyone to have access to it.
Thanks, Duncan. Does anybody else have any questions for Duncan? Okay. Well, is there anything more, Duncan, that you'd like to say or to share with us today?
Sure. I'm gonna just share with you my website super quick, so you know what it is, and also because there's some resources. I'm not sure if any of your teachers, but maybe there might be things that you find helpful, or if you know other teachers that may find it helpful. So I'll just share that really quick. Let me see. So my website is just my name, Duncan Tonatiuh, all together. And there's this little tab here that says More. And has a little video of how I create it has that video of that this fourth grade teacher made. It's sweet if you want to see it again or share it. You know, a little bit of how I create my illustrations, but there's also some great teaching resources here that I encourage you to check out, with just different lesson plans and different ideas for how you can use some of my books in the classroom. So, and that's just on my website there. So feel free to visit it if that's something that would be useful to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Duncan. And then just to say, we had put in the chat here a survey that will disappear when the call ends. So please find that. And if you are so kind to just leave some feedback for the book festival and today's event. But beyond that, I just, for everybody here, want to say thank you, Duncan, for joining us at the book festival today and for sharing information about your journey, about your books, and just how this process has been for you and for the folks that have read your book. It's just so wonderful to be able to hear all the different stories.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. I was happy that I was able to be a part of it.
We're happy too. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lyn, for hosting the event, and thank you everybody for joining us this morning. Wonderful. We'll call it a day then. Thanks everybody. Thank you for tuning in, and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye everyone.